name is Rory Schneider. This is my speech to inform. My audience is Aubrey, Kevin, Shelby, and Troy is my cameraman. Nokota horses are a rare breed of horse from North Dakota with a legendary history. So what is a Nokota horse? This seems like it would be a simple question to answer, but it's not. The reason is, Nokota horses have a very rich and colorful history. They are essentially a combination of different horses bred by the Native Americans, and then crossbred with cowboy horses, and refined even further by Mother Nature due to the conditions in which the horses live. The ancestors to modern horses actually originated in North America. At some point in history, these original horses migrated across the land bridge to Asia. Over time, due to various environmental pressures, the horse population in North America went completely extinct. The first horses to return to mainland North America arrived with the Spanish conquistadors in the early 1500s. Conquistadors like Ponce de Leon, Cortez, and Coronado brought Spanish horses with them to invade Mexico and then ventured further into the American Southwest. Eventually, the first real horse population would be established around 1598 by Coronado when he set up an establishment in New Mexico. This marks the true return of the horse to North America. The first Native Americans to acquire and utilize Spanish horses were the Apaches, the Comanches, and the Pawnees in the Southwest. The Spanish tried to maintain strict control over their horses, but this was of course impossible, and many of them were stolen. It didn't take long for the horses to reach all the way to the northern plains, the region of present-day Montana and the Dakotas. Here in this region, the Sioux Indians acquired their first horses through stealing and trading. By the 1700s, about 200 years after the first horses landed, the Sioux had established herds of their own and had become expert horsemen. As Native Americans began to breed horses that suited their purposes, the Indian pony was born. Horses revolutionized Sioux life and became so integrated into their culture that they were invaluable. Horses that could be used for war and hunting buffalo were highly prized, and so only the finest horses were selected for these purposes. There is debate over the Native Americans' breeding practices because there's almost no documentation to support their techniques. Whatever their methods, however, they used selection to create horses that were perfectly suited for their purposes. They needed horses that could chase thundering herds of bison and charge into battle against enemy fire, and so they selected for quality traits like toughness, stamina, and intelligence. The Sioux also selected for color based on spiritual reasons, and it was believed that the blue horse, Blue Roan, was the favorite because it was similar to a thunderstorm, which gave it the power of the storm. And so for over 100 years, the Sioux enhanced their horse herds through stealing, trading, and breeding, and in doing so developed swift, hardy, intelligent horses. By the end of the 1800s, there was a tide of white settlement which swept across the Sioux Nation and nearly wiped out the entire culture, horses and all. The Northern Plains were among the last strongholds for Native American resistance, however, and Chief Sitting Bull, leader of the Lakota Sioux, was one of the last leaders in the region. He is credited with leading the largest fighting force of Native Americans ever assembled and would defeat Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. After the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Sitting Bull knew that retaliation would be fierce, and so he fled to Canada, where he stayed for 4 years. After the 4 years of refuge in Canada, he decided to come home, and when he did, he was forced to surrender. Conditions of the surrender were that he turn over his horses. So, many horses were sold at auction, and many of them were killed. Luckily, a famous Frenchman named the Marquis de Morez took an interest in the Indian horses. He founded the town of Medora in North Dakota and had a cattle operation and wanted to breed with the Sioux horses. In 1881, when Sitting Bull surrendered at Fort Buford, the Marquis de Morez bought 250 mares for breeding. A few years later, in 1884, the Marquis de Morez sold about 60 of the mares to the owner of the large horse breeding operation called the HT Ranch in Amadon, North Dakota. The HT Ranch used the Indian horses to enhance their ranch horses and give them more stamina. Some of the horses used for breeding still had scars from the Battle of Little Bighorn. The horses were ran on the open ranges of the Badlands in North Dakota, and once the HT Ranch closed down its operations, many of the horses ran wild in the Badlands. Later, in the 1940s, almost 100 years later, when the Teddy Roosevelt National Park was created, many of the horses were inadvertently fenced in. The horses have been running wild in the park ever since. The true history of the horses would not be discovered until the 1980s, when horse racers Frank and Leo Kuntz took an interest in them. These two brothers knew that the horses were tough, and so they wanted to use them for breeding. But once they started using them, they realized, or they became interested in their history. A researcher named Castle McLaughlin dug deep to uncover and document the colorful history of the horses. Frank and Leo Kuntz decided to name the horses Nokotas, and preservation efforts began. Preservation efforts by Frank, Leo, and Castle would eventually lead to the establishment of the Nokota Horse Conservancy, which is a non-profit organization dedicated to saving and promoting the wild horses from the Badlands. The history of the Nokota horse is as colorful as the horses themselves. Their ancestors started in North America, then circled the globe. They sailed from Spain across the Atlantic Ocean, where they would be used to conquer a new continent. In North America, they would be bred by Native Americans, and then by cowboys, and then they would run wild. Now, thanks to preservation efforts, the horses will continue to be a living history.